How do you respond to claims that Christianity appropriated mystical practices from older mystical traditions, for example, the Upanishads? I found some perennialist claims compelling, but intuitively off. Any help is much appreciated. So, for those who are not familiar, perennialism is the intellectual movement which purports the idea that all spiritual and religious traditions around the world are genuine witnesses to the inner truth of things. So they have some non-random connection. In fact, a very deep non-random connection to the actual world as it is. And the actual world as it is innately purposeful. So it's not random. It's not just chance and matter. Usually there's the idea of the supreme God and our being created to enjoy the contemplation of God in whom the good pre-exists eternally. But none of these spiritual or religious traditions, according to this school of thought, has a particular or unique connection to the truth of things. Now, the problem in terms of the inner structure of perennialism is that certain of these religious traditions have as an essential aspect of their character their unique claim to relate to God as he really is. So Christianity predicates its claim to exclusivity, that is, exclusivity in terms of its witnessing to the truth of things, on certain historical events which are said to have occurred. The incarnation, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. It's very hard to say that if Jesus was in fact raised from the dead, that Christianity is just as much connected to truth as is any other religious tradition. Now, there are certain religious traditions in the world, quote unquote, because that word is not always especially useful, certain religious traditions in the world which don't have this kind of historical rootedness to them. So what we call Buddhism today, Buddhism originates not as a distinct religion, but as a school of thought within the larger tradition of Indian metaphysics, philosophy, and spirituality. So Siddhartha Gautama is, one among many teachers who establishes a school of thought kind of analogous to a philosophical school in the Hellenistic world. And he has a particular, spin on things. But his experience is not unique in the way that Jesus' experience is unique. It's not that he accomplishes something definitive so much as he realizes something which is already true about the world. Now, I think that we should say that perennialism sometimes captures genuine connections among the religious traditions of the world. And it's a really important point to embrace the biblical history of the world, because according to Scripture, all human beings are descended from Adam and Noah, right? So Adam and Noah did not live that long before Abraham. And Adam and Noah didn't really live that far before the documentation of all these other religious traditions that we find from antiquity and around the world. So when we see the Upanishads, for example, this is not being written down that much later than the concrete historical disclosure of God to the Father of all mankind. I've mentioned before how we find all of these connections among the world's cultures and traditions. Almost all human cultures have a memory of a global flood. It's just a fact of reality. Almost all human cultures have a memory of a global flood. Almost all human cultures have a memory of a definitive event associated with a tower or the cosmic tree where the world's nations and languages were created and divided. So, you look around the world and you find that mankind seems to share a common memory. And you look around the world and you find that mankind seems to share a common acquaintance with a being who is identified as the supreme God, the creator. Not only so, but all around the world, you find that mankind has this notion, not only of the supreme God who inhabits eternity, but also of the idea that the supreme God acts through a secondary divine hypostasis. So in the kind of anthropological literature, this is called the demiurge. That word is associated with Gnosticism in our mind, but what it means in the anthropological literature, you are welcome. What it means in the anthropological literature is this is just the instrument by which the supreme God acts. So the supreme God is the God of heaven. He transcends all things. He's God most high. And then you have the messenger, the angel, or the word of the Lord, and that has analogs across Gentile religious traditions. So I talked with Jay Dyer a few weeks ago about the notion of paganism and why I don't think paganism is an especially helpful idea. Because when we talk about paganism, people use that word to refer simply to Gentile religious traditions before the coming of Jesus Christ. So if you talk about a righteous Gentile, people will say righteous pagan. But that's a very inaccurate way of thinking about Gentile religious traditions, because there were plenty of Gentiles who were not idolaters before the coming of Christ, and even apart from direct influence from Israel. Did Noah worship the God of heaven, or did he worship idols? Well, obviously, he worshiped the God of heaven. And if the biblical account of human history is true, then we should expect that to have continuing representatives throughout the history of the nations. When Noah gets off the ark, when he offers all clean animals to God as an ascension offering, he does so as an offering to God of all creation. God remembers Noah on the basis of that sacrifice, and then God guarantees through Noah that the creation will continue in existence. And having received Noah's sacrifice, he makes Noah a king, grants him the authority to implement the death penalty. And since the death penalty is the highest penalty that there is, it by implication grants the civil magistrate authority to. Yes, hello, bugs. It grants the civil magistrate authority to implement whatever penalties are less than that. And so we see throughout the cultures and religious traditions of the Gentile nations that the head of cult is the head of state. So in the Israelite covenant, you have a high priest and you have a king. When the various Gentile manifestations of the old covenant, the head of state, the king, is the high priest. That's why you see at the end of the book of Genesis, Pharaoh levies a 20% tax on the whole nation. Well, the maximum tax a civil magistrate can levy is 10%. And then there's a tithe of 10%. So Pharaoh is both of those, and thus he levies a 20% tax. So we have, in addition to just us living in the common world created by God and acquiring truth that way, we should recognize the possibility that many of the connections we see between Christianity and the other spiritual traditions of mankind are connections that derive from the common memory of revelation that had been made from Adam to Noah. Even in Mesoamerica, very late in Mesoamerican history, one of the most brutally idolatrous societies on the planet, there was a school of thought which was not idolatrous. There were those who were very critical of the worship of these bloodthirsty idols. And these men believed in the supreme God who unified all things in himself and to whom all things owed their existence. So when we talk about older mystical traditions, we have to ask, on what basis do we make the claim that they're older? What does that mean to say they're older mystical traditions? Because human religiosity goes back to God speaking to Adam. And God has continued to be engaged with the concrete life of the human family. And that engagement extends beyond the borders of Israel. In many cases, what the nations had is a memory of the God of heaven. In other cases, there seems to be evidence that God continued to engage with them. We aren't given this information in Scripture. We don't need it, and it doesn't directly pertain to the central narrative arc of the Bible. But it is part of the deposit of revelation, which is the tradition of the human family.